Two operating rooms inhaled at once, sterile air trembling beneath white light. On one side, a small body waited for a second chance. On the other, a working woman offered living flesh as collateral against time. Monitors clipped out a stubborn rhythm that sounded like counting backward. A courier in scrubs gripped a labeled cooler, eyes on the wall clock that ruled over minutes with absolute authority. Outside the glass, snow-muted streets pretended nothing extraordinary was occurring. In the sky above the ocean, a jet clawed through night, its cabin lamped for signatures and finalities. Inside, a man accustomed to buying tomorrows discovered that time ignores money. Within the theater, gloved hands hovered. The first incision would start a race between cut and carry, harvest and implant, risk and the precise, terrifying mercy of timing. 12 minutes stood like a cliff. Before the scalpels and countdown, marble stairs had echoed with shoes built for victories. Charles Whitmore's houses stacked like trophies, their glass designed to reflect a man satisfied with conquest. Hospitals dismantled that illusion in sentences measured for clarity, not kindness. A daughter's scans turned into constellations no astronomer hoped to chart. Words like aggressive, refractory, and palliative arrived with the hush of snow on stone. The staff learned his name from headlines. He learned theirs from name tags as they arranged pillows and pumped morphine with practiced empathy. Wealth provided private rooms, rare consultations, and jets that obeyed calendars, yet could not outmaneuver cells that ignored every bargain. He placed her drawings on a bedside tray and tried not to count the bags dripping life by the hour. Fortresses fail quietly. You hear the crack only after the wall has moved. Amid beeps and disinfectant, a calendar page neared a date that had once meant cupcakes and glitter. Balloons could not enter isolation, yet the idea of celebration insisted on existing. The child's fragile appetite took interest in frosting colors, playlist choices, and whether a paper crown might still sit straight above tired eyes. Staff rearranged schedules like an orchestra retuning before a last concert. A father arranged deliveries, favors, and permissions with logistics that usually closed mergers. Beneath the bustle lay a knowledge nobody named, that wishes sometimes circle endings to keep them from closing too soon. The hospital approved a larger room, gentle lighting, and a safety perimeter disguised as festivity. When the day arrived, laughter trembled between IV poles and plastic streamers. A small wrist wore a bracelet no one wanted. The candles waited, knowing breath would be precious. Years earlier, a house that smelled of linen and polish had needed hands that understood both. Grace Porter arrived with quiet competence and a reservoir of steadiness learned from small apartments and long buses. Contracts assigned her tasks. Grief assigned her purpose. A newborn without a mother grows by collecting anchors. Grace became morning routines, gentle corrections, late-night thermometers, and lullabies learned from an older sorrow she never advertised. Wealth can hire service, it cannot rent presence. The child's in-between milestones, half-tied shoes, nearly done homework, almost brave nights, stacked against a woman's patient yes. Titles insisted on staff. Rooms insisted on family. The house rearranged itself around a new fact. Comfort walks in on soft soles and stays. By the time hospitals learned their names, bonds had already braided themselves into something policies are slow to recognize, but children never misunderstand.
The improvised celebration unfolded like a reprieve. Nurses taped helium smiles to walls that had seemed too many winter goodbyes. Soft cake surrendered to plastic forks. Crayon drawings collided into a gallery titled Hope. The girl wore color because survival loves joy's costume, even while fear waits backstage. A father hovered, careful to amplify delight without stepping on its delicate chord. Grace moved with the choreography of someone who knows when to set a plate, when to adjust a blanket, when to let laughter breathe without questions. The room's brightness disguised the arithmetic of fatigue. Every minute cost energy borrowed from somewhere the body couldn't spare. When the games faded, the smallest eyes searched the face that had held each fever. The question that lived in air finally claimed shape. Pretending loosened its grip. It became clear the clock had opinions. Night gathers courage differently for the tired. After the last dish and the final check of linens, Grace sat with an aging laptop whose screen glowed like a lighthouse for impossible plans. She navigated studies, forums, and footnotes made by strangers who recognized each other by sorrow and stubbornness. Pages translated into late coffee and a catalog of unlikely doors. Gene therapies that lived in headlines, trials with lists long enough to measure summer, medical tourism promises folded around risk. Somewhere beneath jargon waited a path that did not require permission from miracles. Living liver transplant emerged like a rumor made of science. Partial grafts could outwork failing organs if matches aligned and courage held still. Most donors were kin. Definitions felt smaller than love. She noted requirements the way a traveler maps ferries and mountain passes, then closed the screen without sleeping.
Laboratories do not care about origin stories. They care about blood, proteins, antigens, and whether patterns align beyond chance. Grace entered through a side door, arranged by a sympathetic scheduler who recognized the gravity people sometimes carry without uniforms. Vials filled, forms recorded. The quiet hum of machines joined secrets with centrifuges and assays. Waiting became a discipline performed between laundry loads and medication logs. When the envelope arrived, it rattled like a cage holding a wild thing. Numbers and letters that guide surgeons assembled into improbable harmony. Compatibility stepped out from the improbable and asked to be believed. Breath returned as a startled laugh too close to a sob to be comfortable. The match did not prove destiny. It granted an option with weight. Choices become obligations when love sees a way through. She folded the paper like a passport. Hospitals must defend the vulnerable against coercion, desperation, and the invisible pressures that hide inside gratitude. A conference room gathered rationales into binders. An administrator named Walter Briggs pointed to lines that had saved donors from regret and institutions from ruin. Love listened and understood the reasons while disagreeing with the conclusion. A non-kin donor required layers of scrutiny. Independent advocates, psychological clearance, ethics committees equipped to catch manipulation cloaked as devotion. Behind every no lies a litany of harms once witnessed. Grace met the denial with the kind of stillness learned from long winters. She did not argue with protection, she argued for inclusion. Lives do not map neatly onto forms. In the corner, a coordinator observed with the attention of someone who keeps keys to side doors for nights exactly like this.
Megan Clark had weathered enough committees to know that policy's spine can bend without breaking. Professional detachment coexisted with a practical impatience that carried patients past obstacles designed for average days, not extraordinary ones. She arranged an independent donor advocate, scheduled a psychological evaluation, and outlined a legal route that depended on the guardian's informed, explicit consent. The path was narrow and demanded signatures that would pierce corporate skins. Consequences presented themselves like cliffs beside a narrow road. The work shifted from arguing principles to assembling conditions where courage could be recognized as lawful. Protection remained intact. Compassion found a framework. Megan's voice did not romanticize risk, it integrated it. Some nights, the only way through is handholds in rock. She marked them with a pen, then offered the map to people who had more to carry than policy did. Documents landed with the gravity of verdicts. A guardian's consent could authorize the surgical attempt, but indemnities that had shielded a fortune would loosen. Legal teams described liability like weather patterns arriving from hostile coasts. Shareholders, insurers, and boards dislike exceptions that establish precedent. The man who had built a public life on certainty sat with uncertainty's full plate and discovered it tasted like truth. He measured headlines against hospital hallways, reputational risk against the small weight of a hand that had clutched his index finger in neonatal winter. Silence revealed its content, fear disguised as caution, grief rehearsing defeat, pride pretending to be prudence. Decisions, like bridges, are built for crossing. He lifted the pen that had signed acquisitions and carved his name beneath a choice no market rewards. Some wealth is kept only by spending what cannot be replaced.
Stories with sharp edges attract cameras in search of redemption arcs and villains rendered in convenient strokes. A staffer's whisper migrated to a freelance inbox, ready to convert privacy into clicks. Public relations drafted strategies that transformed a child into a narrative tool. The father who once choreographed headlines closed the door instead. Phones redirected to voicemails no one would answer. A severance package found its addressee. A memo insisted that some things remain unwitnessed by strangers until outcomes are no longer fragile. Reputation is a currency. He chose to pay it. Hospitals sigh with relief when theater remains outside their walls. Inside, a girl slept with a paper crown still soft from earlier joy, and the woman who meant to save her rehearsed breathing like a craft. Protecting quiet can be the loudest thing a person does. Courage visits like weather, not architecture. On the last night before surrendering to anesthesia, Grace's practiced steadiness flickered. Hallway shadows lengthened, monitors muttered, doubts assembled a courtroom in her head. Pain, complications, failure, and the possibility of a child losing two mothers instead of one took seats as prosecutors. She sat in a chair designed for waiting and remembered a sister who had died in a room that smelled the same. Memory can be anchor or undertow. Her hand found a folded drawing tucked into her sweater, 3 stick figures beneath an enormous sun, colors pressed hard enough to leave grooves. Promise prefers artifacts. She named the boundary between fear and decision the way sailors name reefs, then charted around. Sleep did not arrive. Resolve did, carrying its small lamp, asking only for the next step, not the entire map.
Morning wore blue gowns and clipped syllables. Consent was rechecked, lines secured, surfaces draped into fields of sterile snow. In one room, a seasoned surgeon drew landmarks on a mother's abdomen, a cartography of vessels and ducts that would need to be honored. In the other, a pediatric team prepped a receiving field as gentle as prayer. The courier rehearsed the path, measuring doors and distances as if inches mattered, because they did. Timing in this choreography was not poetic, it was biochemical. Coolers earn reverence when contents can restart futures. The anesthesiologist narrated vitals in tones designed to lower heart rates at a distance. Scalpels kissed the skin like punctuation that ends argument. Within minutes, the race began in earnest. Divide, protect, carry, connect, and convince 2 bodies to agree on a new arrangement neither had evolved to expect. Midway across an ocean, a private jet became a confessional. Contract language sprawled across a tray table, ink drying beside a photograph carried longer than grief admits. Turbulence reminded a man of physics, and physics reminded him of limits. He calculated time zones, organ viability, what-if ladders, and the accounting of promises kept too late to change outcomes. Power's costume looks foolish in the dark. He wrote letters without recipients, practicing sentences that might one day fit inside a thank you neither party would think adequate. The map on the cabin screen advanced like mercy when it chooses to be visible. Pilots negotiated descent while a surgeon negotiated a hepatic vein. Landing lights searched for ground. In another hemisphere, a clamp released, and red returned to a segment of tissue built to regenerate when given permission and a little luck.
Hospitals choreograph reunions with an understanding of fragility. The intensive care unit did not celebrate. It allowed breaths to continue. 2 beds shared a room because narrative sometimes assists medicine. On one side, a small chest lifted beneath warmed blankets. Tubes and lines furnished her like scaffolding around a cathedral saved from collapse. On the other, a woman lay pale as paper, her face emptied of performance but not of strength. Machines made a forest of quiet sounds that translate to progress for those fluent in their music. A father learned to hold still the way patients do. He counted inhale, exhale, beeps, drips, and the seconds between nurse footsteps. Relief does not arrive as fireworks, it enters like a person removing shoes. He placed a hand on 2 forearms in turn and decided staying is also an action. Orderlies learn where families hide talismans. A folded envelope surfaced from beneath hospital linen, edges softened by worry's oils. The note's handwriting leaned forward as if eager to finish something begun long ago. Words written without audience nevertheless found one. The sentence at its heart carried the simplicity of oaths exchanged in kitchens, not courtrooms. It documented consent beyond legal frameworks, a moral clarity that institutions cannot notarize, but occasionally honor. The paper changed hands carefully, as if it could bruise. A father read and understood that language can lift weight when bodies cannot. He placed it in his jacket, then on the bedside table, then in his wallet, then back on the table, unwilling to let it belong to any single place. Some artifacts prefer to remain within sight, reminding those who breathe that yes is heavy and good.
Victory never sprints through immediate corridors. It limps thoughtfully past thresholds. Vitals climbed and dipped, an uneasy tide in a bay still learning moonlight. A graft spasmed the way new arrangements protest being asked to work so soon. Teams assembled with the precision of firefighters, flooding the spark with expertise, coaxing chemistry back toward balance. Alarms sounded like arguments they refused to lose. Medications negotiated with receptors, clamps loosened, pressure lines found less dramatic rhythms. In these long stretches, heroism looks like repetition. Check, adjust, wait, recheck, chart, breathe. No one clapped. They nodded to each other with the respect of craftsmen. Outside, dawn rinsed the city in a thin light that flatters nobody. Inside, numbers settled by degrees, and a room exhaled. Fragile quiet returned, not triumphant, but welcome as a chair offered to a weary guest. Days unfolded in measured increments named by nursing notes and medication times. A father who had outsourced care his entire adult life learned the economy of small tasks that cannot be delegated. Dampening a cloth, smoothing a wrinkle, reading paragraphs a child barely heard but wanted near. Grace, asleep inside a medically commanded stillness, received the same patience from people who understood that listening to machines is also a form of attention. Sharon Lee, head nurse, curated the tempo, translating doctors' plans into hours ordinary enough to endure. The unit's windows held winter at arm's length. Visitors tiptoed. Staff carried purpose without performance. In these corridors, love is logistics executed kindly. The vigil taught humility to someone famous for confidence. He discovered that presence contains work no resume records, and that gratitude can be practiced silently with extraordinary effect.
Recovery likes to arrive disguised. A twitch refines itself into a flutter, then a purposeful motion. A child's eyelids tried on morning, color pushed gently into cheeks used to pallor. Nurses collected around the bed with the casual gravity of people who love good news but never court it aloud. The first sentence requested normalcy dressed as dessert, an instinct older than diagnosis. Laughter crashed into tears without apology, cleansing the room of days the clocks had hoarded. The second question redirected celebration toward absence, reminding everyone that victory is incomplete when shared hearts beat on separate sides of sedation. The father learned, again, that explanations have to wait for bodies to be strong enough to bear them. The ICU resumed its hum, now tuned to a key closer to major, still cautious, quietly grateful for a turn toward possible. An evening later, the second bed returned its tenant to the conversation. Opening eyes became an undertaking that required concentration and reward. Light sharpened, edges stabilized, and faces stepped out from blur toward belonging. Machines that had spoken on her behalf lowered their voices as if remembering manners. A small figure in a paper crown held the pose of ceremony, presenting survival as a gift wrapped in crinkled laughter. Tears honored both fear and its retreat. Nurses adjusted pillows with the tenderness of co-conspirators. Language would take hours to organize itself, understanding needed only seconds. Across the room, a man who had employed this woman for years recognized the thinness of titles when stacked against action. Gratitude, unable to locate sufficient words, borrowed stillness and stayed close. The unit, designed for emergencies, permitted joy to walk through quietly and sit.
Science loves caution, yet cannot hide its delight when data bends toward kindness. Post-operative labs sketched graphs that arced away from catastrophe. Imaging suggested therapies now had allies where before they had met barricades. The new organ's function created conditions under which medicine could do more than hold the line. On rounds, language shifted from if to while, from whether to how. Optimism learned to walk before it tried to run. The staff recalibrated dosing and nutrition. A child demanded puzzles. A woman practiced shallow breaths that stung but promised capacity. Prognoses turned from anchors into sails. Nobody announced a miracle. They documented progress and scheduled tomorrows without flinching. In hallways, shoulders lowered a fraction. In the waiting room, coffee tasted less like surrender. Recovery wrote itself in small fonts on many pages and expected signatures from everyone present. Wealth had bought galleries of apologies wrapped as gifts, yet none had weighed like the unadorned thankfulness now required. In a room humming with beeps and the faint scent of antiseptic, a man measured his past against the generosity laid beside his name. Appreciation traveled awkwardly at first, like a guest not sure where to place hands. It found purchase in attendance, in listening to clinical updates without steering, in agreeing to follow up regimens that prioritized 2 bodies over 1 corporate calendar. He called foundations and asked to finance roles that protect donors from pressure and neglect. He wrote a letter with fewer adjectives than any he had ever authored, and understood its economy as reverence. Gratitude, done properly, aims outward. Its success is measured not by eloquence, but by habit. He planned to practice until eloquence was unnecessary.
Hospitals share stories the way sailors share maps of reefs, carefully, with respect for currents. A narrative about a non-kin donor reached break rooms where cynicism usually owns the coffee. Staff who had long ago learned to compartmentalize found those compartments politely invaded by something softer. The account climbed out of the building on borrowed shoes, entered local newsrooms, then attached to feeds with a velocity powered by collective hunger for rare forms of courage. The people at the center requested privacy and were granted more than most receive. Beyond the doors, strangers argued about policy, ethics, and whether love qualifies as documentation. Inside, 2 patients progressed along charts signed by nurses who had witnessed countless endings and needed this middle. Fame pressed its face against the glass. The story declined to perform, choosing instead the stubborn housekeeping of healing. Committees reconvened with thicker packets and less certainty. The case transitioned from anecdote to catalyst. Walter Briggs, whose job had been to hold the line, provided context other administrators rarely risk. Past harms avoided, current protections maintained, gaps that punished exactly the people policies claimed to guard. Megan Clark presented pathway refinements, independent donor advocates funded properly, coercion screens designed to catch subtler pressures, consent processes that respect families built by bond instead of blood. Debates sharpened without cruelty. Institutions change like glaciers, ponderously, until heat accumulates. Pilot programs appeared in footnotes first, then in calendars, then in staffing. Bureaucracy performed its alternative magic, codifying decency so it doesn't require heroics next time. Signatures made in carpeted rooms began to prepare future hallways for fewer goodbyes. Paper, when used well, can save lives long after applause ends.
Elsewhere, the public executed its rituals of astonishment. Murals,
Hashtags and fundraisers rose and fell in waves predictable enough to plot. Interviews were requested with increasing insistence. Awards drafted themselves in advance of acceptances that never arrived. The central figure declined politely, redirecting light toward the practices that had made survival plausible. Charles accepted cameras when they promised policy change instead of personal spectacle, converting notoriety into endowments with guardrails. The narrative proved resilient precisely because it refused drama's easy hooks. It offered, instead, logistics and love braided into a rope strong enough to pull a child toward a future. The storm did what storms do, spent itself. What remained were altered protocols, a funded program with initials no one would remember, and a family rediscovering ordinary days. Attention moved on. Consequence stayed and learned to do dishes. Recovery exchanged drama for routine. Calendars sprouted follow-up visits, blood draws, and lists of foods that respected a new organ's temperament. Immunosuppression introduced schedules as exacting as train tables. Each clinic corridor passed without catastrophe became a festival stealthily observed. Hair returned with a different idea of itself. Laughter loosened its sentence structure. Appetite reinvented childhood rituals around popsicles and pops of delight. In a garden that had once been merely decorative, a child practiced walking farther than yesterday without supervision shadowing her steps. Shadows shortened. Time rejoined the family as something other than an enemy. Photographs retreated from hospital lighting into sun. The body relearned secrets it had refused to share during illness. How to run without planning. How to sleep without calculations. How to forget to be brave, because joy required both hands for something else.
Houses remember. This one released the echo of footsteps that had sounded like worry and replaced them with clatter that resembled living. Staff schedules adjusted to needs rather than appearances. At the long table, food arrived without ceremony and tasted better for it. Grace occupied a chair not assigned by payroll, her presence recognized as architecture rather than decoration. Titles, those brittle containers, gave way to roles proven in fire. The father, who once walked corridors like a shareholder, now took up space like a participant. The child drew with new supplies and old themes. 3 figures beneath a sun that kept refusing to set. On a shelf, frames shared space without competing. A wife remembered, a daughter restored, a letter that would remain the household's quiet constitution. Wealth, when humbled properly, learns hospitality. Doors stayed open longer, light stayed late. Philanthropy gained a spine. An initiative launched without ribbon cuttings loud enough to alarm the people it meant to help. The fund placed advocates in hospitals where staffing charts always come up one short, trained them to recognize pressures invisible to policy, and paid them well enough to remain when headlines drifted elsewhere. Data would arrive later, in graphs that administrators could bring to budget meetings. For now, outcomes carried names. Aunts by love, coaches by devotion, and neighbors by proximity found pathways that didn't demand hero status to qualify. Clinics borrowed language from the program's manuals. Ethics boards borrowed courage from its case studies. Grace attended no ceremonies. She preferred mornings where school lunches required assembling, and a child reminded adults that ordinary is a miracle in comfortable clothes. The fund's letters arrived annually. She filed them under enough.
A year completed its circle and returned carrying cake thick with frosting and candles that meant something beyond math. Color reclaimed authority over rooms that once preferred quiet. The guest list blended classmates with the nurses who had slipped laughter into bleak hours and deserved to witness this sequel. A father held a camera as if it might break if misused. It did not. Grace inspected plates with a general's focus and a gardener's pride. The child drew breath like a rehearsed aria and extinguished flames without assistance. Applause belonged to everyone, and therefore to no single pair of hands. Gifts unwrapped themselves into puzzles, paints, and promises to visit parks. The house accepted noise as therapy. In the dining room, against a wall that had watched so much, a frame reflected lamplight and language and the weight of a vow kept. Evenings arrive in this house with the softness of solved problems. In the family room, 3 silhouettes negotiated a jigsaw's last stubborn pieces, the table sticky with lemonade rings that nobody scolded. Through a doorway, a letter in a frame maintained its vigil, words that had studied the difference between permission and surrender and chosen their side. The camera this time belonged to no one. Memory volunteered to carry the scene forward. Outside, the lawn forgot arguments ever held here. Inside, the clock learned to announce bedtime without menace. No orchestras closed the story, only a lamp switched off and a staircase climbed without counting. The inheritance awaiting the child would not be measured by trusts or headlines. It had been stitched beneath her ribs and drafted into the habits of a home that now knew the shape of mercy.